What's up, gangsters? It is a fine sunny day out here at Rube Goldberg Enterprises. Sunny but freezing cold because it is the 10th of December. So this is going to be a sort of a review, semi-long-term use video. A couple of months ago, one of the guys in Scale Modeler's critique group who runs a small business over in the UK, part of which includes selling grex airbrushes, hit me up and asked me if I wanted to test one of their trigger style models. And I was like, well, sure, I'm interested. I don't have any issues with my iwatas, but I've always been curious about grex products. And he wanted to make it happen, and I was willing to take him up on it. So he made the arrangements, and Grex sent me one, and my agreement was that I would use it for a while and make a review video of it. And so that's what this is going to be. Obviously, I'm telling you this now after the fact. So what you're about to watch is basically sort of my little video diary of how that went over the last 6 weeks. And I'll just tell you up front that overall it went pretty well. I have maybe 1 or 2 reservations about the thing, but overall it's a really good airbrush, and I think you'll agree after you check this out. So here we go. Okay, so let's check this thing out. As you can see, it came very nicely packaged in this sweet little case with the clear top and all the cutouts in the foam. This is the actual box, and it did have some reading materials, a pretty nice little instruction manual, and this card. This is what immediately caught my attention, because this kind of is more about the entire grex airbrush system than it is an instruction card. And this kind of tells you what you can get and how they try to cover all the bases with just 4 airbrushes, which is a good philosophy. I mean, I just from an engineering standpoint and a user standpoint, I can't think of any real reason why you really need a whole bunch of different models and all of the accompanying manufacturing and inventory complications that presents. This is a modular system. They have the traditional top trigger and the pistol grip, and within that, basically what you can do is select whether you want side feed or top feed, what size nozzle you want to run, and what size cup you want, and basically get exactly the solution that you're looking for. They even offer a fan spray cap, and it's pretty interesting to me that the needle sizes go all the way from 0.2 to 0.7 millimeter. Obviously, for a 0.7 you may need a larger compressor, and a fan cap, same thing. But nonetheless, the only thing that I don't see here is anything with a MAC valve. And obviously you can get an inline MAC valve, so that shouldn't be a deal breaker if you like to use the MAC valve for certain effects like I do. This also talks about the magnetic spray cap or needle cap, whatever you want to call it, which is pretty cool. Take a look at that in a second. And then they offer also some complete packages with compressor. But here's what really caught my attention is this chart on the back of this little brochure tells you what needle sizes you can get for each one of these. So what I've got here is the tg3, which means that it's the top feed trigger grip with a 0.3 millimeter needle in it. And you can see also that you can go up to a 0.5, which would make it similar to my Iwata ep208, and especially if you put a fan cap on it. Then if you go down the other direction, a 0.2 millimeter needle puts it in the same territory as, at least in theory, the Badger Sotar, because it has a 0.18 millimeter needle, which for all practical purposes is at least, numerically the same thing. Now, every needle shape is its own thing. Just because two different airbrush manufacturers have the same needle size doesn't mean that their nozzle and needle design is anything like the same. So it's not really necessarily an apples to apples comparison, unfortunately. There's not really any standards that I know of. So I'm not saying that I think that this thing with a 0.2 millimeter needle in it would necessarily perform exactly the same as a Sotar, but it is definitely worth considering, for me anyway, because the one thing about the Sotar is that it is a regular top trigger style airbrush, which even with the high roller trigger on it that I have is a little bit tough for me to use with my poor finger dexterity. That motion of holding the airbrush and pulling and pushing the trigger is just difficult for me, and that's why I use this type. So I expect that once I've put this thing through its paces for a bit using the 0.3 millimeter needle in it and seen how it compares to my workhorse Iwata Neo, which you can see here is pretty filthy at the moment. This thing gets a lot of use. I probably do 80% of my work with this thing. I use it, so much I've turned into a total slob and don't even put the tail guard on it anymore. I just leave the needle sticking out there because I end up pulling the needle a lot. But this has been a really solid airbrush. I've been using this thing steady for a couple years now, and the only thing that it really has sort of irritated me with is it seems to have developed a slight leak in the air valve, and so if I have it plugged into the hose, my damn compressor is coming on all the time, which is kind of irritating. So, but look, from a use standpoint, this trn1 has been rock solid. I can do lots of things with it. I rarely find it lacking, and that's only if I need to go up or down in size. This is a 0.35 millimeter needle, and if I want to spray a really fat pattern, then I'll, like with a bunch of primer or something, then I'll go to my Iwata HPTH with the 0.5 millimeter needle. And then on rare occasions where I feel like I can't shoot a really, really small thing, then I might try the Sotar. But this thing will go pretty small, especially with MRP in it. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this thing compares. It has a slightly smaller needle in it. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it does. Now, one thing I like is that this package is pretty complete. You get 3 different color cups. I'm choosing to run the medium-sized one. But the really sweet thing that I like about this, I say sweet, I don't know how much I'm really going to utilize it, but this magnetic air cap thing is pretty cool. You can see it just comes right off of there, and as I found out last night, it pops off easily and goes flying underneath your workbench. So be careful with that. But then you have this crown cap looking thing, and if I can manage to pick it up, I'll put it on here. But I confess that I've always been curious about these, but I've never felt so curious or compelled that I would go out and buy an airbrush that has one on it, because I just haven't ever felt like I had to have it. But you can see it just pops right on there if you want to switch it out. And I guess the theory with these things is that it enables you to get super close and do really fine lines, I guess finer than you would get with this normal air cap, but yet without letting you bump the tip of the needle into whatever your workpiece is. So anyway, that's a pretty handy thing, and I'm going to be checking it out here directly when I put some paint in this thing. Okay, so here we are just a little bit later, and I have done my first little bit of painting with this thing, and my initial impression is awesome. No surprises, good or bad. I did not change my setup overall. even a little bit. My compressor is set on about 15 psi, which it normally is. I just plugged this thing in, dumped some Mr. Surfacer 1500 into it. That stuff is thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner at about 50-50, kind of my go-to primer. I needed to do a little bit of spot priming on these parts, so I was going to paint large and small. And I basically just handled things exactly as I would have if I had plugged my Iwata Neo onto the hose. And honestly, in a blind test, I don't know that I would have been able to tell any difference. But one thing I definitely noticed was that this grex seems to spit the paint out a little bit faster than my Neo does, even though it is a slightly smaller needle, which I thought was interesting. And that was kind of confirmed when I went through the paint in my cup quite a bit faster, maybe not quite a bit faster, but perceptibly faster than I would have if I had been using the Neo. But it was interesting that it did not collect much paint inside the air crown, air cap, whatever you want to call it. I haven't cleaned that. That's how it was when I was done spraying. And the Neo always collects a lot of paint right there. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I also did not have any difficulty spraying small. You can see I was doing some spot priming here to check the way that these welds that I've made with epoxy putty look, and so I was spraying a relatively small pattern, and you can see pretty tight, pretty clean. Obviously there's some overspray, but I would expect that shooting a primer thinned at 50-50 and it being a little bit cold here in my workshop space. But I also shot some lines on this little piece of paper, which doesn't say a whole lot. Paint always behaves perfectly when you shoot it at a piece of paper. But I wanted to put the crown cap on and kind of do a comparison. And I kind of felt like it did actually let me spray smaller with a little bit more confidence than the regular cap. Now, whether that was because it actually changes the spray pattern or because it lets me get closer with confidence, I don't know. But for spraying this little pattern of modeling right here, I practically had the airbrush resting on the surface. And you can see, again, there's obviously some overspray that I would expect, using paint that's that thick, but pretty tight. I mean, not bad at all. I would be totally confident in using that as a tool to shoot a similar pattern on a model. And you can see some other little fine lines I did there. So, and it was nice to be able to just stop, pop the regular cap off and put this one on. So that's pretty cool. Again, no real surprises. It's a solid performer right off the bat, and I am going to go forward and use this thing for at least the next month in all the same ways that I use my Iwata Neo, which means that I will probably shoot lacquers, acrylics, and maybe even some hairspray through it. I am not a believer in having a different airbrush for each different application, so metallics, regular paint, whatever it is, I feel like if you know how to clean your airbrush properly, you shouldn't have to do that. And the way that I clean mine is as soon as I'm done shooting, and I don't do a field strip between color changes. I will let them run until they start acting goofy, and then I'll do a field strip. But I find with using mostly the MRP lacquers that I do, that it's really not necessary. In fact, sometimes if I'm spraying MRP and I'm shooting similar shades like with metallics, I don't even rinse the thing out between color changes. I just go straight from one to the other and blow out the old paint until I get the new paint. So That might be a little bit barbaric, but it's just the workflow that I've developed because I use these things day in, day out, and I don't really want to waste a lot of time and energy on unnecessary cleaning. So what I do, just normal usage, when I'm done with my session, I throw some lacquer thinner in there if I've been using lacquer paint. I swirl it around, get it good and cleaned out. Get it good and mixed up, and then I blow that out. Then I put some more in there. I use a little paintbrush to swirl out the color cup and clean the inside of the air cap if I need to. Blow that out. Put a little bit more in, do a back flush until it's running clear, blow that out, and then I put it away. The only difference is if I'm using acrylics, that I will start that process with an alcohol-based thinner simply because that's really enough for an acrylic paint to at least get the cleaning process started. So anyway, that's my normal process, and that's how I'm going to run it for the next month. And if I expect it to go well. If I do anything special along the way, I will add to this little video diary of the thing. Okay, so here we go. This is round 2 of using this little Grex airbrush. I've primed all of these Tamiya 1/6 Honda Monkey parts with my go-to mixture of Mr. Surfacer 1500 that's thinned about 50-50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner. And all of this spraying ended up being about 4 eyedroppers full, or it's about an eyedropper full is 1 draw of the eyedropper, ends up being about 2 mils. So I went through 7 or 8 mils of paint to do all of this, which is probably about right, but there is no doubt at this point that this thing does move the paint faster. I have not changed any of my setup since I started using it, and I'm thinking that maybe I'm going to drop the pressure down from 15 psi to 10 and see how that works, because it definitely moves the paint faster, and it definitely seems to come on a little quicker at the trigger, sometimes a little quicker than I want it to. I was being pretty liberal with the primer on all this stuff, to be fair, but there were a couple of times where I was like, whoa, Nelly, not quite that much. So anyway, I think it's going pretty well, and we'll see how the thing performs when I do a little bit more serious painting with it. Okay, so here it is, early December, like the 10th. And I have now been using this Grex airbrush for about 6 weeks, pretty steady. I've sprayed a number of things through it. Pretty much the only paint I've run through it has been MRP. And that's just reflective of my workflow these days. This stuff is pretty much all I use for just about everything because it's just so good and so easy. Obviously that's a lacquer. It's ready to spray straight out of the bottle. I've also sprayed some primers. Well, really just one primer. My go-to Mr. Surfacer 1500 thinned 50-50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner. I've also sprayed some 2K primer from Gravity, which if you don't know what 2K means, that basically means that it's a 2-part urethane, and it has to be mixed with a hardener to activate it, just like a 2K gloss clear urethane clear coat does. And I've also sprayed some of that through this thing. And just like in the previous clips, things have gone overall really well. I mean, I think that this is a really solid airbrush. It's continued to perform, predictably, and overall, I've been really happy with it. The one thing that I have not been super happy with is something that I mentioned a couple of times in the first 2 clips, and that is that I was starting to notice that it has a tendency to come on pretty quick. It's tough for me in certain situations where, say that I'm spraying a really small area and I want to spray just like a little touch up or something, I've found that it has a tendency to barf, you know, and just blow out a bunch of paint suddenly, and give me, you know, some spidering or spattering or whatever you want to call it. Now, part of that I have cured, at least, maybe not totally cured, but at least made not quite as bad by turning the pressure down on my regulator. So whereas I was running my Iwata Neo pretty much all the time at like 15 psi, I've been running this thing at about 10 or 11, and that's helped quite a bit. But it still has that point where the trigger just suddenly comes on. And part of that's down to my lack of good fine motor control, but I think it is also reflective of a difference in the design of the needles, even though on the surface they should be pretty close to the same, given that one is a 0.35 and one's a 0.3. And actually that kind of defies logic in its own way, because the Iwata is a little more predictable, in my opinion, at that initial trigger opening, and it has a slightly larger needle. But I'm going to talk more about the needle thing in a minute. The other thing that I have done to try and minimize that problem is I got my hands on another needle kit. Now, as I've mentioned, one of the cool things about this is that you can switch between 0.2, 0.3, 0.5, even 0.7 millimeter needles. And so I thought, well, let's try this thing out with a smaller needle and see how it does. And maybe, you know, we'll get some real interesting results. Now, I ran it with the smaller needle for like less than a day, like half of a day. And then I did a stupid thing. As you can see, I don't have the tail guard on here, and I tend to keep that off because it just makes it easier to pull the needle out at the end of the day if I feel like it's dirty. And I've just kind of gotten in the habit of doing that. And I had originally gone and bought this 0.2 millimeter needle kit, which, as you can see, comes with the needle, the nozzle, and the spray cap and the wrench. And it's about $40 for this. And the day that I had started using it, I was really pleased with the performance, but then I dropped the airbrush on the floor, and of course it landed exactly on the tail end of the needle, and it had enough force to basically drive the needle through the front of the nozzle and split it wide open. So it was toast. Fortunately, Sean Middleton, the guy who got me set up with all this in the first place, was sympathetic, and he got his buddies at Grex to just send me another new one. So I got it replaced, but I haven't used it yet. And so what I thought I would do at this point is just do a little quick spraying right here on camera so we can all see kind of what the difference is between the two needle sizes. So I've got some of this MRP black. Nothing special about that. Just going to put a little bit in the cup, and we'll just spray a few lines here and see what the result is. What's on here was sprayed with the 0.3 millimeter needle that's in here. So here we go. Let's just spray a little bit. See, there it is right there. I'm just barely trying to crank that thing open, and I immediately get a splatter. Now, to be fair, this is the first time I've picked up the airbrush today. I'm not at all warmed up, and so some of that is just down to my clumsiness, because as you can see, I can get it to do what I need it to do and spray in small amounts, but when I really get in there close, I have to really be careful to just crack that open. Okay, so that's what I can do with the 0.3 millimeter needle. And it may just be that it was because it was that very first shot. I don't know. Maybe there's something about the needle being basically clean or whatever, and when you very first crack it open, something happens that causes that. I don't know, but at any rate, what I'm going to do now is blow this paint out of here, and we'll swap the needle, and I'll talk a little bit about that part of it, because one thing I've also found is that this airbrush is pretty easy to clean and keep clean, and the needle swap process, while it's not something that I would want to necessarily do every day, it's really not that bad. I think I would probably end up leaving one needle set in there pretty much most of the time. And that's the feeling that I was starting to get after only using the 0.2 millimeter needle, even just as briefly as I did, that it was probably going to end up being the default needle that I kept in it all the time. So let me switch these out, and we'll see what the difference is. As you can see, it didn't take much to get this thing reasonably clean. Now, and this is something else I've noticed. I don't know why it is, but even though I tighten the needle chuck nut with my fingers, whenever I come back to it, for whatever reason, I can't ever undo it with my fingers. And I end up having to get out my little vice grips. It's just I have weak fingers. But anyway, there we go. And you can see that needle is filthy. I mean, that is mangy, nasty. Got lots of paint skinned all over it. So, you know, that could also be contributing to my problem of the thing just wanting to barf paint like that. I don't really know that it's a valid observation, but I'm surprised at how nasty that needle is. It is nastier than my iwata needle usually is when I pull it out. But to be fair, I also pull the iwata needle out more often, because for some reason the iwata, and I've found this on both my Neo and my HPTH, that the needles tend to stick on them a lot. I don't know why it is. They just get a little bit of paint or whatever stuck in the seals behind the needle, and they just stick. I mean, it happens. It's not a big deal. And before you say, well, it just means that you need to clean your airbrush better, I have had completely stripped down and cleaned airbrushes, put back together, and next time I pick them up, a few days later or a few months later or whatever, the needle's stuck. So there's something just weird about that. Anyway, point being is that for whatever reason, the needle on this grex doesn't ever seem to stick. And so I find myself never pulling it out. And so while that's a good thing, it may also result in it being overall nastier because I don't take it out and clean it as often. So anyway, I'm just running my mouth to try and fill up time while I do this part because I'm slow. But I may just pause the camera too. Anyway, taking this thing apart, pretty straightforward. They give you this nice little wrench, and which I obviously am very clumsy with, but it's not bad. So I'm going to get this thing apart as quickly as I can and swap the needle, and we'll come back to it. Okay, real quick before I put the air cap back on this, one thing to notice is that this is part of how thoughtfully these guys have put this system together. You could easily get confused about which nozzle you had in the thing if you did not recognize this one, if you look, has a groove machined around it, and the 0.3 millimeter needle does not. See that right there. And the others similarly have different numbers of grooves in them as well. So pretty clever. I like the way that they've thought this thing through and made it very user-friendly. And another user-friendly feature, of course, that I also already pointed out is the magnetic air cap. If I can get it off of there. That's pretty cool. And I believe also, if you look, see at the back of this needle, it has a couple of grooves in it that also tell you that it is a 0.2 millimeter needle. Seems a little weird that the nozzle has two grooves, or the nozzle has one groove and the needle has two, but whatever, that's what they sent me. That's what's in the kit. So there we go. All switched out, and now let's shoot a little bit of paint out of this one and see what the difference is. And I also did not change the pressure, so I will if I need to. Yep, yeah, just a big splatter. And again, that's just me mostly, I think, just being clumsy. That's why normally I like to crack the needle open. See, it's just hard to control. I really expected it to instantly be easier because it seemed that way when I ran it the first time. But whatever. Doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of difference there. So I just dropped the air pressure about 4 psi. So now it's around 7. Not bad, but still, that paint is coming out of there pretty fast. Just frustrating. Especially because what I was hoping with this 0.2 millimeter needle is that it would, you know, basically turn this thing into something more like a sotar. And it will obviously spray some really small lines, which honestly, I think we get a little too hung up on that because that's just not something that we really have to do that often. What I find that I want to do more often with spraying small like that, I mean, black basing is one thing, obviously, but what I'm more often than not, what I'm doing when I am spraying small is I'm doing touch-ups. So that's pretty good right there. I mean, but that's also why one of the reasons why this splattering thing doesn't cause me more trouble than it does is because I always spray off the workpiece first before I start actually trying to do something. And that seems to help no matter what kind of paint you have. And it is especially good if you happen to, for whatever reason, have a little bit of buildup on the needle, and that first little shot of paint might splatter like throw droplets, I guess is what I really mean. So it's always a good idea, in my opinion, to spray at something unimportant first. But nonetheless, it's just a lot of paint coming out of there pretty quickly. I can say that it's easy to spray these denser, darker small lines here with this size needle than it was over here with this one. But is this just automatically striking me as easier and better to use? I don't know. I'm going to have to spend probably another month using this needle before I can really come to any hard conclusions. And I probably will. I think I'm going to just continue to use this airbrush because it is working well for me overall, in spite of this one sort of annoying little thing, which again, I mostly have dealt with just by cutting the pressure down and just being a little more diligent in blowing it out before I shoot. It's also true that with these MRP lacquers, they are super thin, and so that sort of thing is, that's always going to happen more with thinner paints. But just out of curiosity, I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to blow some thinner through this thing real quick, and then I'm going to switch it to my Neo, which is totally clean and has not been used in 6 weeks, and see what happens with it. Okay, so I've switched back to the Neo, and I went ahead and turned the pressure back up to what's normal with me for it. So it's back up to about 15 psi, and you can just hear how much less noise there is with the airflow. So for whatever reason, I just feel like the Neo moves less air and therefore less paint. And I have an idea about why that is that I'll get to here in a second, but let me just shoot just a few little squirts with this thing. It's been a while since I've used it, so this may be a disaster. But see, immediately I'm spraying little bitty lines with it. It did not immediately just burp the paint right out there like the Grex did, and this is what I'm talking about. And again, this is not an issue I run into very often, but it's one of those things that when you need to spray small, obviously you're doing something critical, and so it can be a frustrating thing. Okay, so that kind of illustrates my instincts about the thing, and you can see kind of what I mean about the differences in the way it sprays. I'm going to clean this out and then come back and talk a little bit more about why I think maybe that happens. Okay, so after I got those all cleaned up, I took some measurements because I thought this was going to explain the differences in the way that these things spray. And yeah, well, not so much. I have always just kind of had this feeling that the needle in my ep208 was this huge beefy thing, and that when I measured them, that I would see that it was much bigger than any of these other needles. And I thought that the needle on the grex was going to prove to have a larger diameter. And the reason that I wanted to measure this is to make a point as well. A lot of people don't realize that there really is not a measurement standard for airbrush needles. Just because two airbrushes say that they have the same size needle or nozzle or whatever does not mean that they're going to have the same performance, as you can see. And the truth is, I don't even really know what that number means. Ken Schlotfeld, who is the owner of Badger Airbrush, told me at one point that it's a measure of the angle of the tip of the needle. And if anybody should know, he would, but I've never had any verification of that. And that just seems like kind of an odd thing to me, because I don't understand why you wouldn't just use the angle if that's how you wanted to define it. But nonetheless, the number is almost meaningless, especially when you're comparing across brands of airbrushes, but sometimes even within the same product line, you'll see that number doesn't mean a whole lot. So, point being is, I wanted to measure the actual diameter of these needles and see if that offered any sort of explanation. And I was surprised, because my perceptions were really not that accurate. As it turns out, the grex needles are the largest, but not by much. I mean, you can see that when I measure back here at the tail of the needle, the grex is 1.39 millimeter, and on both of them, both the 0.2 and the 0.3 millimeter needle measure the same overall diameter, and it is slightly, but only slightly larger than the Neo needle, which is 1.34. The real surprise here was that my Neo and my TH have the same size overall on their needle. The only one that was really different is the Badger Sotar, which you can see it's supposed to be a 0.18 millimeter nozzle, and it has a 1.2 millimeter overall diameter. So that doesn't really explain much. So one thing that you have to look at is the shape of the end of the needle. And so I thought, well, let's pull this out of here and see if there's anything obvious that might tell us why these things are different. And there really is not. I mean, when you look at these two needles, the Iwata needle is on the left and the grex needle is on the right. And when you put them right next to each other, there just really is no discernible difference to my eye. So I don't see a lot of explanation there, but clearly there is a difference. So maybe it just comes down to the air valves. I don't know. But you can definitely see when you hold these two needles right up next to each other, that slight difference in the overall diameters. So that may come into play as well, because if you're starting at the same at a larger overall diameter, but you have the same angle at the end, well, the part that pokes through the nozzle is obviously going to have a larger diameter at the same point. I don't know. It really depends on at what point along the taper the needle engages with the nozzle. So I don't know that I feel like I've explained or even learned anything there, other than that that those needles are different, which we already knew. One thing that you can't really see that's sort of interesting about the TH, and you look at the tip of it, and I don't know how the grex 0.5 millimeter needle compares, but when you look at the tip of the well, and there you go. See what I was talking about? Clean airbrushes with sticky needles. This airbrush was cleaned thoroughly on the same day that my Neo was, and put back together, and the needle was just now stuck. But when I pull it out, and I can feel like it's got some, see, it had a little bit of dried paint up there on the barrel of the needle. Anyway, look at the tip of the TH needle. See, it's not even pointed. It's just a big blunt thing, which that thing needs some cleaning. So, at any rate, that's kind of interesting, but doesn't necessarily teach us much. What is of more value probably is literally the value with these airbrushes. And so I wrote down some other numbers here, and this is the pricing on these things, because What's cool with the grex system is that you get this modularity that allows you to sort of build the airbrush that you want. So you buy the base airbrush for 180 bucks, and these are Amazon prices, by the way, and that gets you one needle size. You could spend another 80 bucks or so, so you're in for now just under 300, and you've got basically 3 different airbrushes. Whereas, to go the other route, you spend nearly $500 to buy a Sotar, a Neo, and an Iwata HPTH. Now, granted, what you're going to get out of these 3 is obviously more refined than what you're going to get out of buying this one thing with 3 different needle sets, but you can clearly see the value proposition that Grex is putting out there. You basically get a much more versatile setup for your 300 bucks than you will over here going a more traditional route. Okay, so there it is. Hopefully that gives you guys a pretty good overview and some insight as to how the Grex trigger style airbrushes work and how they kind of stack up against some other things. Hopefully you can agree that overall it's a really good product. As I pointed out several times, my only reservation about it was that it does occasionally, or it has the tendency, I guess, to really blast the paint out. And maybe blast is an unfair word. It just comes on a little stronger than my Iwata. And that's just part of the fact that overall it just seems to move the paint a lot faster. It seems to have a higher flow rate than my Iwatas do, and that causes me some frustration. But again, as hopefully I demonstrated, you can see that you can overcome that, at least in part, by running it at a lower pressure and by switching to the smaller needle size. Another thing that I think would be effective is putting an inline Mac valve on it. Hopefully you guys have, if you guys have watched much of my stuff, you know already that a Mac valve does not control pressure. It controls flow rate, cubic feet per minute, at least if you're in the United States, where we insist on using those silly old units. At any rate, I've actually ordered the Grex Mac valve, and I'm going to give that a try and see if that helps. But I also got it because I like doing stippling techniques, and that's for me where a Mac valve really pays off. And normally I have to switch over to my HPTH to do that because it's the only airbrush I have that has a Mac valve on it. So I've wanted to have one in line for a while anyway, and so I just decided to go ahead and order one. The Grex one was about 29 or 30 bucks, which is a little more expensive than other Mac valves out there, but it has a really large knob on it, and I kind of like that because, you know, my fingers being what they are, larger knobs are better and easier to turn. So I guess the final analysis is that if I were making a recommendation, or someone came to me and said, hey, you know, I'm looking for a trigger style airbrush, because that is specifically what this is about. This doesn't, you know, this review, or whatever you want to call it, is really not for you if you don't prefer trigger style, if you're totally cool with regular true double action style top trigger. This doesn't really apply to you. But if somebody came to me and said, hey, I'm looking for a trigger style airbrush for whatever reason, what would you recommend? I guess I would have to say, well, it kind of depends on how versatile you want your system to be. If you want to cover the range of needle sizes from 0.2 to 0.7, then the Grex system is a little more expensive up front, but it's a really good value, and you'll get more for your money on the back end as you expand your system to include more options. If you really demand a super high precision fine line airbrush, well, A, you're not going to get that in a trigger style because nobody really makes one apparently, and B, even though you can cut the line size down quite a bit, but by putting the 0.2 millimeter nozzle set on the Grex, it still isn't going to be something like a Sotar. So you have to take that into consideration. But, you know, Well, as I've said, I don't really find the need to spray that tiny that often. So to me, that's not really a big consideration. And so I think if you could handle a slightly higher upfront price, and that you were, keeping in mind those caveats, I would say go for the Grex. And it has nothing to do with the fact that they sent me one for free that I get to keep. I just genuinely think that if I were looking at this upfront, brand new, not having already bought anything, that this would be a pretty compelling option because of that versatility. On the other hand, if you already have the top and the bottom end of the ranges covered, and you just need something that's kind of right in the middle, and it's just going to be one airbrush, then I would probably lean more towards the Iwata, because the Neo is a bit less expensive up front, especially if you can find a coupon, which are pretty common for those things. So overall, the Grex is a great product. I could totally recommend it. As to whether or not it's better than the main competitor out there, which is the Iwata Neo, trn1 and trn2, I think that just kind of really depends on your specific situation and what you're actually looking to accomplish overall. So hopefully that makes good sense, and hopefully this has been of some value to you guys. And as always, I definitely appreciate you watching. Much love.